Okay, today is September 18, 2012. This is Forensic Interviewing of Children, Section 2. Last week we did a bit of housekeeping. We were in a different classroom. Today I'm in College Hall 310. I have all of the electronics that help me present the materials in this class, so hopefully you have a better appreciation of how the content in this class is delivered. And we did get a chance to start out last week with some substantive things. The thing we chatted about at the end of class last week was the potential for clinicians to find themselves in a dual role. That's what I posted on YouTube as the 20-minute end of class beginning lecture last week. Remember, we talked about the fact that sometimes mental health professionals are asked to do evaluations of kids. They do evaluations of kids. They do a mental health evaluation. Very often, under modern clinical characterization, it's called a trauma assessment. And their goal is a little bit different from what we're talking about here, and that is a forensic interview. The expectation in a forensic interview is that the content of what we develop, the information that we get from the child, will be used in a forensic context. Who can tell me what forensic means? What does forensic mean? Say it. You know. Yeah, forensic. Pertaining to legal proceedings. So the information, the content that you develop is expected to be used in a courtroom or a deposition, in some legal proceeding or in some legal context. Okay? A trauma evaluation could very well wind up in a legal proceeding, and in some sense it's forensic, especially if it's done for the court. If the family court judge orders a trauma assessment for some reason, or it's relevant in a divorce or matrimonial case, then the court may, or the litigants may, order a trauma assessment or get some clinician to do an evaluation for trauma assessment. The funny thing about a trauma assessment is it presupposes that what happened? Abuse happened, in the case of child abuse, or some kind of trauma, right? If it's a trauma assessment. Now, you might say, well, they're just trying to see if there is trauma and then evaluate, how much of it there is. But in any event, we ended up by saying, or thinking about the issue of persons who do clinical evaluations later being called into court to be an expert for one side or the other. For one side or the other. And that presents a problem because a trauma assessor is supposed to be as neutral as they come, right? Just call it like I see it. I don't have a special relationship with this child and whoever I interview in my trauma assessment. I'm just gathering information, finding out what happened to the best of my ability, and I'm making a finding about the impact of trauma on this child. I may talk to collateral witnesses. I may do some of the very same things that an investigator might do in child protection or for the prosecutor's office or law enforcement. I gather that information, I assess trauma, and I report back to somebody. And you always got to serve somebody, right? Song by Bob Dylan, got to serve somebody. Well, here, you're serving the court or you're serving the litigants, but you're supposed to be objective. But somebody's paying the bill. You're supposed to be objective. If you're later called to court to testify about whether that child needs special services, or whether that child was in fact abused, or whether that child was competent to say yes or to consent to sex, and that child is in treatment with you, we talked about the fact that you now have a different kind of relationship. The person you're serving is the child, and not the truth. It may sound like, oh, aren't they the same thing? Not always. Not always. So it puts clinicians in an awkward position. Avoid dual roles if you're a clinician. Today we're moving on. That's where we ended last week. We talked about it and I put it online. We're going to start today by jumping back into Professor Fowler's book and take a look at the models for forensic interviewing or assessing child abuse, as she calls it. You don't need to open your books, but it begins at page 35 if you want to make a note in your notes. That's chapter 3, and your readings were due today. And she describes the various kinds of child sexual abuse assessment models in America right now. There are a few others that she may not touch upon, but she hits on the big ones. The child interview model. The essential component is the interview with the suspected victim. Since most children do not come to an evaluation on their own, usually an adult brings them, and the adult gets interviewed as well in the child interview model. The child interview model has its origins in Child Protective Service investigations. It's the kind of stuff that DIFAS does, the Division of Youth and Family Services in New Jersey. And it's what we do in prosecutors' offices throughout the state. The child interview model. It's a one-time event. You bring the child in. The child is usually accompanied by a caregiver, as Professor Fowler points out. That caregiver is interviewed. We're going to take a close look at that later in this course, how that goes down. We interview the caregiver because we want to find out information about this child, about their experience, about the words they use, their relationship with the perpetrator, and other things we'll talk about later. The bottom line is you get one shot at interviewing the child. In most jurisdictions, the child is not interviewed a second time. One time. That's the child interview model. And it's described in greater detail by Professor Fowler. And she points out its pros and its cons. A single interview is effective with children who have already disclosed sexual abuse, writes Professor Fowler. And she's right. What she means is that when kids make a statement to a guidance counselor, to a friend, or to a teacher, or to a relative, the cat's already out of the bag. And the single interview, the child interview model, kind of works best with that type of disclosure. Disclosure meaning a statement by a child about molestation. And she opines that when a kid already makes a prior disclosure, before the forensic interview, before the investigators get involved, this model works pretty darn good. She says it's most effective with kids who are older, yes, and children who are abused by a non-parental figure, yes. This is the most parsimonious of models and the most widely employed. The practical reality is that high-volume referrals in many agencies use this model, but it's not good for doing involved or complex assessments. She's saying that agencies like DIFAS and county prosecutors' offices are so busy, it almost compels this model. And again, what do we mean? A caregiver comes in, a kid comes in, some background information is elicited, and then an interview is done. This is a 2-hour process. And then next case. I'll give you a little peek into the future about children's recollections and about forensic interviewing. You can get quality information in a single interview, in the kind I'm talking about. It is a little problematic at times. Professor Fowler is exactly right. It's not ideal for all kids. But for most kids, in the context in which forensic interviewers work, it works well. It works well. But sometimes, with complicated cases and kids who are trying to protect the perpetrator because they have a loyalty to them, it's their stepdad or their uncle or their teacher or their best friend's dad or someone else that they have a special relationship with and they want to protect, things get a little thorny there. They become a little more difficult. However, if you interview a child in the manner I'm describing, the single interview, child interview model, as Professor Fowler calls it, you can get enough information to move forward. Even in something as significant as a criminal investigation that requires a lot of stuff to go to court, prove someone guilty of a crime and put them in jail. The single interview model works pretty well, even for law enforcement, which has a heavy burden to to move forward. You're not going to get all the information, but you're going to get enough to move forward in many cases. When a child is interviewed in this process that I described that typically takes 2 hours, you're never going to get the complete story. You may get 1/5 of it, 1/6 of it, 1/9 of it, 1/10 of it. Who knows? You're often going to get something less than the whole for a variety of reasons. Even a gifted psychologist who went to Harvard and has interviewed hundreds of children about trauma, he's not going to get the whole story in that 2-hour period. They're probably going to get as much as a talented, experienced forensic interviewer working in the field in law enforcement or child protection. It's not ideal, but it works. You get the most information and the highest quality information when you interview a child across multiple sessions with a single experienced interview. You get the most information and the highest quality information. What information? I mean, what happened? What happened, kid? For the past 3 years. What happened? What happened to you? When did it happen? Where did it happen? All the stuff we want to know, that's the information. You get more of it. And you get higher quality information when you interview a child in multiple sessions, more than once, by the same interviewer who's experienced and competent and good at what they do. The research has demonstrated that to us quite clearly. Unfortunately, due to the high volume of cases in child protection and criminal investigations, you can't do that. You can't do that. DICUS gets hundreds of cases a month. You cannot do multiple interviews with children about abuse. It's just not efficient, and the payoff is not significant. So you may get in the first interview that Daddy came in my room from the 2nd grade to the 4th grade. He used to climb in bed with me and touch me all over my body. And a couple of times he put his mouth on my vagina. Right? And that, provided that there's enough detail and it's satisfying the disclosure and persuasive and there's some other evidence and some prosecutor feels comfortable with that, that's pretty darn good. Multiple incidents over a period of time. His hands are all over her body. He's in her room. He put his mouth on her vagina. That's a first-degree crime. And that's an act of cunnilingus. It's prosecutable in New Jersey. We've got elements of crimes here. Okay? You're going to get that maybe in that first interview, but you may not hear about the time it happened in the back of the 7-Eleven in the car, or the time that she had to lick his scrotum, or the time that he put his finger in her butt a little bit, or the time that he made her flush the condom down the toilet. You are going to get some of the information. Some of it might be detailed, but to get details and all of the story, and you never really get all the story, but most of the story, you need to go back and visit this again. That's the way human memory works. That's the way kids and people talk to strangers about the most sensitive of things on the face of the planet, right? Being exploited by your dad or your uncle or your cousin or your mother or somebody you love and trust and care about. I mean, there's 50 reasons why kids don't tell you the whole story. Take it from me. You're not going to get the whole story, but you'll get enough. And law enforcement and child protection don't have time. I don't say that to be disrespectful. I say that to be practical. They don't have time to go back and get all of the nuances of what happened to them. We want to go forward with them and the next kid and the next kid and the next kid and the next kid and the next kid. And it doesn't add much more value to the child protection action. And it doesn't add much more value to the criminal prosecution to find out these nuanced details about flushing the condom down the toilet and putting his finger a little bit in my butt and licking the scrotum. Those are things that may not come out the first time, but you'll hear about later. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you had to tell the story about your first class here, or you went to see the, the Rutgers South Florida game, or you went to the Renaissance Fair in New York, and I asked you about that experience, a week later, you'd tell me some stuff about it. and we talk for 45 minutes, and then maybe we bring it up again a month later and talk about it some more, and I can guarantee you I'd hear more the next time about the Renaissance Fair, the Rutgers South Florida game, or whatever else you experience. It's just human nature. There are other things at work that might impact the quantity of information that you get in that single interview. But suffice it to say that you don't get it all, you get some of it. Because kids disclose in stages. They disclose incrementally. They disclose a little bit at a time for many reasons, which we will get into. We're going to get into the psychology of how kids experience abuse in great detail. And the more we know about how kids experience abuse, the better we'll be able to ask them questions about how they experienced that abuse with this guy. So, you can do it with the child interview model. It does work better with multiple sessions with a single experienced interviewer. Okay? The joint investigation model. Professor Fowler offers this. She says the joint investigation model is implemented in a variety of ways. It may involve a co-joint interview of the child by law enforcement and child protection, DIFAS. When the interview is co-joint, there may be a primary and secondary interviewer, with the secondary interviewer taking notes and asking additional questions after the primary interviewer has exhausted his or her inquiry. In other instances, one professional is behind a one-way mirror while the other interviews the child. There are other ways to implement this kind of thing. Me, not a big fan. Not a big fan. But let me elaborate a little on Professor Fowler's description. This one is where you and I, or child protection and law enforcement, go into the interview room. One of us takes a primary role. We've got a pad and pen. The other one's got a pad and pen and sits at a right angle. I talk to the child, I talk to the child, I talk to the child. I don't have any more questions, Gabriella. This is Miss Maria. Miss Maria has some questions for you. Yeah, I want to ask you blah, 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 blah. Miss Maria takes notes. I get some ideas. My turn again. Her turn again. You don't have to use a pad and pen. Many people using this model do. The best way to do it is to video record it. Okay? Because then there are less issues about what exactly happened in the interview, and less issues about suggestibility, because unless you write everything down the child says, you will write some of what the child says down, right? That's called taking notes. There's nothing inherently wrong with taking notes. But the mere act of taking notes communicates. Tell me why the mere act of taking notes communicates. Okay, with me? Why would the mere act, why would something we do communicate something to another human being? Taking notes. Sounds like a good idea. You're in the room, you're taking notes. You want to make sure the record's clear for future generations, for the judge and everybody else. Think about it for a minute. You ask the child a series of questions, go ahead.
You only take notes on what you think is important.
Yeah, and what does that mean? Why is that?
That's bias.
Well, I don't know about bias, but what is the message to the child?
That everything he or she is saying is important to put it down on paper.
Right. Now, I'm not so sure that the kids get the message that we're being disrespectful, but that the parts that are not being put down are not
Important.
and the parts that are writing down are important. And, you know, we worry about being suggestive to kids, and in some ways, implicitly, we're suggesting something here by what we write down, and we'll...
That's what I was going to ask.
What?
Suggestibility.
Oh, okay. Well, since you were about to bring that up, give me an example about how taking notes might be perceived as suggestible. Make it up, hypothetically. You ask the kid something, X, Y, and Z, and the kid says this, and you choose to write that down. Think out loud about how that might be suggestive and reinforcing to a child about what you want to hear. At least the child thinks that must be what they want to hear.
Well,
Let her hurry. I'm sorry.
children sometimes ramble when they're telling stories. So, as they're rambling, and you're just going off of basic, like, let's just say, yeah, well, he took me to the park, and then we went there, and then he touched me, and then he grabbed my hand hard, and you're just writing specifically on actions, not places, not things. They're thinking, they could think, oh, well, she's only writing action, so maybe I'm going to be more creative and, give her more action or over-exaggerate what happened rather than sticking to the specifics or what actually took place. Because they're noting that you're only writing down actions, they might over-exaggerate something that occurred, and you're suggesting that because they're telling you actions and that's what you're writing down, they're going to give you more. So that's where maybe false allegations could occur, or maybe, pointing out something that didn't really happen, but they say it happened because you led them to believe that you were more interested in actions rather than what all took place.
Well put. I get a little more detail than that. Go ahead. I'll comment on what you said. You had
I
something
say
you want-
that they're observing you
Right.
as they're answering, so it's supposed to be is that they're going to answer the way they think you want them to answer.
Right. Exactly. And you're talking about actions, but we can be more specific than that. The actions might be, hey, I'm getting some feedback now. When I say that Dad put his hand on my private in the park, that action part, she started to write down, and then she leaned over and she was interested in what I had to say. That's the kind of stuff. Now, this kind of mental machination doesn't happen consciously with some kids, but they might want to give you more of that, I'm going to tell even more about that. And there might be parts that I don't really remember, but I'm going to dress it up a little bit because I'm getting some attention now. Go ahead.
Well, couldn't the other side be true, that they wouldn't tell you things because they see you writing things down, and now they're going to withhold because they're seeing that that's the important stuff, and you don't want to get the person in trouble?
Excellent. I like the way you say it. Either way, you emphasize something they may want to pile on, they might want to tag along, they might want to give you more of the same, they may want to tell you what you want to hear, or, because the opposite is often true, the thought that children go into child protection or prosecutors' offices and make accusations against their loved ones about sexual manipulation and sexual exploitation because they need attention, because they couldn't go to some kid's birthday party, or Dad wouldn't let them ride their bike, or some silly notion like that, is way overstated. It's very, very rare. In fact, the opposite is true. Most kids that get interviewed by child protection, especially about sexual abuse by someone they know, trust, or love, most kids have an incentive to minimize and not tell and withhold information. The opposite. So while some kids who have a malevolent, bad agenda might want to pile on and add to the actions because they're getting that kind of reinforcement, most kids want to go in there and say, nothing happened. No, I don't know what you're talking about. I never said that to my friend. They either withdraw what they originally said or minimize what they originally said, and we're going to look at that kind of psychology in great detail later. But what was your first name? Tony suggests here maybe the cue works both ways. Now they know what she's writing down. That's the kind of stuff that gets Dad in trouble. I'm going to kind of switch that up a little bit. Well, he was kind of helping me on the monkey bars. He wasn't touching me like he wanted to hurt me or anything. And this happened when I was in the monkey bars. Now you've communicated that interaction is really important because you chose to write it down, and you know what? It is important. Bless you. We don't need to cue the child, every 3.5 minutes what's important. So good, yeah, writing's not a big fan. You don't need to write things down. Not a big fan of two people in the room either, The more people in the room, the more intimidating the environment, the more uncomfortable the environment, okay? And it's difficult enough to communicate with little kids. It's difficult enough for people to open up to strangers. Of course, it's difficult enough for people to open up to strangers about these kinds of things. And we add another person in a room. The more people in the room, when you get questioned, the more anxiety. Okay? Imagine if you were being interviewed to get in the graduate program. You're going to get here at Montclair State, you're going to try to get in the graduate program. Now, it's one thing if you were called into my office and we sat down, and you told me this, I told you that, and we talked about what is it that attracts you, whatever the dialogue was about. Contrast that with if you had to go in. It was me, Dr. McCormick, Jacqueline Catalano. There's three of us now. Two of us are listening, one's talking, and she chimes in, you chime in. I think for most people, the more people in the room, the more anxious the interviewee feels. And it can be a little hostile and intimidating and scary and confusing. And part of what we do is spend a significant amount of time, percentage-wise, of the overall interview in building rapport. We're talking to the child, trying to connect with them a little. That's part of every forensic interview protocol is kind of building a little bit of trust here. You're not going to build major trust or rapport, in 37 minutes. But you can build enough. One thing about kids is they're very trusting. They're naturally trusting. That's why, in many ways, they're exploited. Right? That's how they wind up being molested. Predators prey on that vulnerability of children. And it works both ways. In this context here, you may have enough time to build some basic rapport and trust with the child. 2 people in the room, 3 people in the room, I think makes it more difficult for the kid to feel comfortable. But some people use this model. It's a model. It can be done. Now, people who practice it might come in and have 20 reasons why what I'm advocating has its shortcomings as well. And Professor Fowler points out some of the, and I'm not going for every word she says, you need to understand this for your general appreciation of forensic interviewing and also for when we do our assignments and the exam. This other models, I'm not so sure it's used much anymore. The parent-child interaction model had its origins in mental health practice in the 70s and 80s. Some clinicians, trying to understand the causes of maltreatment, came to the conclusion that maltreatment represented distortions in bonding between parent and child. While there may be some truth to some of that, I'm not so sure how that would allow us to conclude or better gather information by watching parents and children interact. The divorce cases, what the matrimonial cases help to popularize in some jurisdictions this parent-child interaction model. And let me see where she gives us an evaluation of this sort would usually include review of background material, a separate interview with each parent, and an interview with the child, as well as an observation of the interactions between the child and each parent. An unusual version of this model is that advocated by Haynes Stayman and Hart in 1988, which actually has the child present during the assessment of each parent, in addition to a parent-child session with the interviewer absent. Some clinicians allowed the accused parent to confront the child regarding the allegations of abuse. Now that's Gardner. I'm not sure Kaplan and Kaplan. Gardner was a person who was a psychologist. He found himself in a bitter matrimonial action where the outcome, to say the least, he disagreed with the outcome, and he dedicated much of his life, professional life, to coming up with different theories about how kids can be misled and falsely accuse people. Allowing the perpetrator to confront the child is never okay with me, and never okay in most jurisdictions, if not nearly all of them. But this is something that's advocated by some outliers in the psychological community back in the 80s and 90s. And it really, in some sense, is not very forensic at all. It feels very clinical, right? Talk to the parents, size them up, interview this, watch, think, interpret, infer. Right? That's not forensic. Infer, think, conclude, draw deductions. Maybe I shouldn't say it that way. We do that all the time. It's very forensic. It's like what we draw deductions from and what's reasonable to draw inferences from differs between forensic work with law enforcement and child protection and some clinicians. It's not widely used, by the way. I don't know of anybody who ever adopted this parent-child thing. Now, the aspects of this may be used in therapy, and maybe aspects of this are used in evaluations about whether a kid belongs with one parent or the other, right? That kind of makes sense. If you can watch a child interact with their caregiver and you're doing a child custody evaluation and you're trying to conclude as a mental health professional who the kid's better off living with now, based upon a million factors, a variety of factors, one of them might be watching through a two-way mirror or on video or in some manner how the kid interacts with the caregiver. And how much weight that should be given, should vary, I imagine. But that's a different issue than determining whether a kid was abused or not. The comprehensive assessment model. That's the last one that Professor Fowler offers to us. And she says that to a considerable extent, the comprehensive evaluation model has evolved because of criticisms, especially in court, of simpler models. Although models involving a single professional who gathers information from a variety of sources are described in the literature, comprehensive assessments can also be conducted by multidisciplinary teams. Now, we have concluded after many years, and for many years now, that it takes a team to interview a child. You simply can't have the cops go and ask the kid what happened, and that's the end of the issue. For the past 20 years, we in law enforcement have worked collaboratively with child protection, with medicine, with mental health, and other professionals in accepting an allegation of child sexual abuse, or even physical abuse, but child sexual abuse, and evaluating it and drawing conclusions about whether it ought to be prosecuted criminally, whether it ought to result in a change in custodial relationship between the child and the caregiver who's accused, and those kinds of things. So comprehensive assessments can be conducted by multidisciplinary teams. That is, these professionals, the mental health professional might do a trauma assessment, the prosecutor's office might do a forensic interview, the physician might do a medical evaluation, take a history from the child, and treat that child for any physical trauma or any physical concerns, or just for general wellness. Now that can happen. That kind of interview process can happen over multiple sessions. In fact, it must, because you've got a lot of different disciplines involved with that child and getting information. And before, when I said that prosecutors and child protection use the child interview model, we do, but we do that in the context. We do that in the context of a joint investigation, where we evaluate what the child says to all of the professionals that are involved in the case. So it's a multidisciplinary interview. But those initial decisions are made simply by interviewing the child. And then later on down the road, what the team develops may enhance the disclosure, it may enhance what the child says, or it may diminish what the child has offered. It may make the case not so believable now. Well, he said her little brother saw what happened, part of it. And the little brother's in a mental health evaluation, and he says, I've never seen anything. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what she's talking about. That would be an example of later information that arose from a different professional about this kid and this case later information arising that diminishes the quality of the original allegation. With a supposed eyewitness says they ain't an eyewitness. Anyway, there's a lot of different ways. I'm sorry, are you raising your
Yeah,
hand?
I just have a question. Where would they conduct the interview of all these teams? The Child Advocacy Center or?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. In most counties in New Jersey now, there are what are called child advocacy centers. And it's just a freestanding building sometimes. Sometimes it's part of a hospital. Sometimes it's part of the prosecutor's office. And like I said, sometimes it's a freestanding building. And in some places, there's child protections there, the doctor's there, there's a psychologist there, and the prosecutor's there, and it's called a co-located child advocacy center. We'll talk more about these things down the road. In some places, like my office, we have a dedicated center, and the professionals come, and then they go. So if we got a case now at 6:30 on Tuesday, detectives from my office, our forensic interviewer would meet there, child protection would meet, the municipal cop would show up, they'd all report to our center, and then they go home. Where some jurisdictions have offices and they live there, that would be co-located. And then there's a hospital one. Some places the kid goes and gets a medical evaluation, and the police might do the interview there. There's a variety of ways this happens. And to just answer your question simply, the kid goes to some space that's dedicated to interviewing children in the community, in most cases. Sometimes kids are interviewed at the school for once in a blue moon, especially if you cannot trust both parents, and it's during the school day. Like if we got a referral at 10 o'clock in the morning, the referral was that mom and dad bring their weird friends from the lake, and they both, mom holds me down and dad fondles me. Well, who are you going to call to bring the kid to the center? You know, both of them are suspects. Both of them, may have abused the child. Both of them have an interest in tampering with evidence or harming the child or influencing the child. So sometimes we may go right to the school and do the interview with the cooperation of DICAS. And sometimes we can just take the kid out of school with the cooperation of DICAS and bring them to the center. But in most cases, you can go to this space to do the interview. So those are the different models. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. And we'll look at more specific versions of these models later on this semester. What they do in Michigan, what they do in the National Institute of Health, what they do the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, what they do up in Minnesota at Corner House and the Finding Words Project. Different child advocates have taken these general outlines of forensic interviews and created strategies or protocols for interviewing kids. And that's in large part what this course is about. And my model is the Corner House Finding Words protocol. But they all have, their benefits, and they are all far more similar than they're different. It's just in the execution of it, they might vary a little bit. And we'll examine that later on this semester. Any questions about the broad outlines of child interviewing throughout the United States? The kinds of different ways? All right. Good enough. Now, let's get in the Wayback Machine. Woo! Go way, way back to the late 17th century. In a little colonial village. In the village of Salem, Massachusetts. And the reason why we need to crawl this machine and go back in time to this very religious community where God was feared and revered, where life was simple and harsh, where people lived off the land, and nearly everybody knew everybody else, and it was tough getting through the winters. If we go way back then, we can think a little bit about this sad chapter in American legal history, because this is about American legal history as much as it is about American history. This sad chapter in American legal history where 19 people, after a trial, where there were judges and due process, where the rules of courtroom decorum and the rules of evidence were followed, 19 people, after the highly detailed testimony of children, were carted off to a hillside and hanged from a tree. The indictment accused them of, the allegations were multiple counts of sorcery. Sorcery meaning witchcraft. And back then in America, it was a capital offense to practice witchcraft, which means you have a death penalty. And die they did, week after week for months. Judges came down from Boston. Very learned and accomplished white men came down and sat at the table. And they passed judgment, and they listened to the testimony of children and the other witnesses who supported the testimony of the children. And they drew legal conclusions. And in the end, they pronounced sentence. And everyone, except for a man named Giles Corey, was sentenced to die. Some of them were in the death row when this was finally abandoned for a variety of reasons. But many had perished by hanging. Giles Corey was a clever old man. He figured out that if you didn't enter a plea, see, I went to grand jury last week on a teacher from Clifton and a doctor from Wayne. And the grand jury chose to indict the teacher and the doctor. Today, the indictments were handed down. Should be in the newspaper tomorrow morning. Kristen Leone, the Clifton High School teacher, Dr. Leonard Joachim, the doctor from Wayne, New Jersey. In about 7 days, I'll be back in court with the doctor and the teacher. They're totally unrelated cases, had nothing to do with one another other than they were indicted on the same day. They will be asked to enter their appearance and give a plea of guilty or not guilty. That's called an arraignment. Giles Corey in 1692-ish, 93 perhaps, figured out that if they bring him for an arraignment in shackles, and they ask him if he pleads guilty or not guilty, if he refuses to say anything, if he refuses to enter a plea, the law says he cannot be executed. I'm not saying nothing, right? Problem was, in colonial Massachusetts during that time period, if you refused to enter a plea, they can use any means necessary to get you to make a plea. And the preferred remedy in Massachusetts at that time was to lay you on your back, put a large plank of plywood on your chest, and have the town fathers place large boulders on the plywood until you give a plea. If you don't give a plea, they pile more boulders and more boulders and more boulders, so at the end you are pressed to death. And Giles Corey never pled guilty or not guilty. Found a loophole. Myself, I'd have preferred having my neck cracked from a tree rather than have a bunch of boulders crush me to death. All of this nasty stuff is because children in that community made allegations that these people had practiced sorcery. And the reason why it's relevant today is, even though this happened many, many years ago, the specter of children's testimony being wrong and adults being falsely accused lives on to today. In fact, the witch trials, or witch hunt, is still used as a metaphor for an overzealous government prosecution. I am sure if you Googled the term witch hunt or witch trial and said on Google, just give me this year, you can actually filter Google results to the past year, you would find thousands and thousands of use of the term witchcraft or witch hunt, because it's an enduring metaphor for a baseless prosecution. Right? Baseless, no. And it's true, there was no basis. There's no such thing as witches, right? If there were witches, different story. The reason why it's so dramatic is not only because the people were hanged And not only because little kids made the accusation, but because we know that the defendants and the accused were 100% innocent. So not only does it tell us that kids can get it wrong, but kids can get it wrong and bad, bad things can happen. And kids can get it wrong 100%. Completely wrong. And they did. So you had the testimony of children that was 100% inaccurate, totally wrong, and dramatic consequences. And that makes for good theater, right? It makes for a memorable few months. It wasn't that long. And the reason why, in part, that it went on for a while was because at first they just made accusations against the beggars and the poor and the people who had no juice in the community. But then they kept going up the social ladder. And they got really bad. In the end, these girls were going around, because they ran out of people to accuse in Salem. They were going to your town, and they were like reality TV stars. They'd come to your town and point out the witches. So if you lived in New Bedford, or you lived in Springfield, or you lived in wherever in Massachusetts, the Salem girls would come and tell you who the witches were. Well, there were still a few smart people in Boston. What the hell's going on here? Get ye down to Salem and see what's going on. And I think in the end they accused the governor's wife of being a sorceress. And that was the end.
The governor,
You read it? Is it governor?
I've been to Salem 4 times. So it's 20 people who died, including down.
Child support, he was at 20.
Plus a dog was murdered before.
Well, that really pisses me off. I'm a big animal. I didn't know about the dogs. I've only been to Salem twice, so but that's cool. Yeah, so they 19 people hanged. No one was burned at the stake. That's very European. We're Americans.
It's very slow death. It wasn't like
The hanging?
It's a
Oh,
very
yeah?
slow death. They don't die right away.
Oh, I don't know. Why would that be?
Yeah, it's more about
Your neck snaps?
no, it's more about suffocation.
Oh.
With the way they hung them. They didn't hang them.
Well, yeah, they went on the road and right, and they made accusations, and eventually it collapsed. All what these kids were saying. But the point is that these kinds of dramatic events, especially within the American legal system, have impact. They had impact not only in the 17th century, but today. It's an enduring metaphor, as I said earlier, right? And even today, people remember that, and they're a bit skeptical of children's recollections or the testimony of children. In fact, I think it is in the article you were supposed to read. They quote, was it Varendonk? Where he said children should never be allowed in the courtroom. And for many years they weren't. In order to be a competent witness in most Anglo-American style courtrooms that relied upon British law like Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Great Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and other similar jurisdictions, you had to be at least 7 years old to be a witness. If you were less than 7, you were incompetent to stand trial. Going back to its biblical origins, 7 was considered the age of reason. Before 7, incompetent, couldn't be a witness. After 7, you could. Now in New Jersey and all over the world, children of all ages are presumed competent, although they could be incompetent. Clearly some children are so young or so immature, or some people are so cognitively impaired that they can't be a witness. And we talk, I don't know about in this course, maybe in here we'll talk later about competence of witnesses. But this wasn't about kids being evaluated or looked at individually. This is about, you ain't 7, you ain't competent. So that kind of skepticism that was fueled in part by the Salem witch trials continued throughout the years and contribute to some of our skepticism today. Those Salem witch trials, big deal. Big deal. Now, this article by Suzanne Davis is about the history of suggestibility research. Now, Salem informs us about a lot of different things involving children and jurisprudence, children and the criminal law, children in the legal system. Because that was a trial, criminal trials. But there are a variety of things we can learn by studying the Salem witch trials in depth. This article is not about the historical skepticism of children in general. This article is about suggestibility research throughout the years. And in fact, Suzanne Davis starts out by saying the Salem witch trials of 1692 are often credited as the earliest recorded instance of children's suggestibility. And they talk about societal panic and how there was pressures on the kids. And you're going to talk about this in your discussion board later, so I'm not going to get too into that. But scientific interest in children's suggestibility really didn't begin until the early part of the 20th century, 20th century being 1900, when European researchers, including Binet, Stern, and I mentioned him before, Verendonk, began to study children's testimonial competence. Kids in the courtroom, that's what we're talking about here. Kids in the courtroom. Actually, there was some scientific inquiry about children's suggestibility before 1900, but much of that research was ignored in prior reviews because it didn't specifically address kids in the context of being an eyewitness. And it was considered to be atheoretical by other reviewers, but nevertheless, it requires some examination. So, Suzanne Davis goes back and takes us in the Wayback Machine now. We're now in the middle of the 18th century here, and she introduces us to another character here, Franz Anton Mesmer. Now, Mesmer was shortly before Napoleon, but shortly after the French Revolution. I'm sorry, it was 5 years before the French Revolution, and certainly before Napoleon. So you still had the royal government. It was not the Directory or any of the governments that followed the French Revolution. In any event, there's this guy, Franz Mesmer, in 1784, and he was a person who began to become well known, especially in the French countryside, because he had special strategies to heal people. He used animal magnetism. He would correct and balance people's animal magnetism. So when he would go out in the countryside and cure someone's ailments, those people would tell someone else who told someone else, and eventually he became very popular. And when he would go out, hundreds and hundreds of people would show up. They would want to be healed. And it helped matters that Franz Mesmer would appear on the scene in brilliant silk robes. He would pass around the patients, fixing his eyes upon them, passing his hands over their bodies and touching them with a long iron wand. And these silk robes would have suns and moons and be colorful. So he was quite a character. But after a while, he became so damn popular that the government started to say, who is this guy? Much like that guy Jesus of Nazareth was going around talking to people in the Middle East. Nobody bothered with him in the beginning. Think about whether you believe him or not. He was a real guy. All of a sudden, he walks in some poor areas of town. There's 300-400 people listening to this guy. Governments get a little worried, where people walk around and they draw large crowds. Well, Mesmer drew large crowds. And his assertion was that he could adjust the levels of animal magnetism in the patients and help cure their ailments. Now, they appointed a commission. The French government, they didn't come down and take away his wand and put him in jail, as some governments might do. They took an intellectual look at it, and they said, you know what, we're going to have a commission appointed. We're going to study this Franz Mesmer guy, and we're going to find out what's going on here. And the commission eventually issued a report to the government, and the report concluded that, because a lot of these people felt better. A lot better. For some, it was almost a miracle. What did the commission conclude? In the end, resulted in these dramatic recoveries for some people. What was it that made people come away from Franz Mesmer's appearances feeling better and wanting to tell their friends so they can go get help? Well, go ahead. Hypnotism. Or what is the basis of hypnotism? Suggestibility. That's what hypnotism is, right? In part. Suggestibility. Suggestibility of wellness, suggestibility of feeling good, Suggestibility of lots of things that make the listener and the patient feel differently about an aspect of their affliction. In fact, from this man's name, we have sort of a synonym for hypnotized. Mesmerized. Woo! Franz Mesmer gave us the word mesmerized. Well, it's about suggestion and suggestibility, right? That's what this is about. The power of somebody through words and actions to influence the recollection or state of being of another. That's what Mesmer did. So we learned a little bit in the mid-18th century France, or late 18th century actually, about suggestibility. Now this wasn't research, but the Commission looked closely at this character, Mesmer. In the 1800s, in the 19th century, now in the 1800s, there were other physicians and writers like Bernheim who looked at suggestibility and hypnotic suggestion. And eventually, there were non-hypnotic principles of suggestion that were used in children's education. Excuse me. And suggestion and suggestibility are not inherently evil. And part of what happened in the 19th century was a conscious effort at taking suggestibility and some of the principles of hypnosis and using them for good. For example, one of the researchers said, hey, school kids always seem to follow the latest clothing and hairstyle fads at the time. If teachers presented course material to students as the latest fad, maybe kids might be interested in it. Small also discovered that children were particularly likely to imitate adults' attitudes and behavior, and recommended that teachers use suggestion to their advantage. If teachers acted generally interested in subjects such as history or arithmetic, then maybe they would imitate and internalize that interest. So the principles of non-hypnotic suggestion were claimed by some to use for positive reasons. And even today, some people use hypnosis to lose weight, stop smoking, right? I mean, non-hypnotic suggestion and hypnotic suggestion are still used today to accomplish social goods, good things. Suzanne Davis points out, though, that some 19th century doctors speculated about, and this is the thing that lingers to today, the link between children's suggestibility and the accuracy of abuse allegations. Okay, this is in the 1800s, not in 2006 or 1983. One of the researchers, Brodell, asserted that more than half of the alleged child sexual abuse victims in his practice were lying. That was his conclusion. He made these claims even when there was physical evidence of abuse. He and Fournier, another French doctor, said that common childhood medical conditions were often mistaken as evidence of sexual abuse by mothers who would later question their kids about possible abuse. And according to Fournier and the other researcher, false allegations against respectable community members happen sometimes. We worry about that today. But let me say something about mothers, grandmothers, and dads, but it's mostly the dads. Did someone go out? Someone's one of us. I don't want to lock her out. It is concerning when a caregiver, usually a mom, misinterprets children's behaviors and concludes that someone is molesting her daughter, for example. And then in an effort, a sincere effort, questions the child in a leading or suggestive way, in a very passionate way about whether dad or uncle or whoever, usually the estranged father, especially in a custody context, this mother would question the child in a highly suggestive way and conclude that the child was being molested. I worry about that, and I've seen it. It's very, very rare, relatively rare. It's way overstated by the persons who are skeptical of child sexual abuse allegations in custody situations. But kids who don't want to go back with dad, kids who regress and have nightmares or wet their bed or get preoccupied with the genitalia or do other things that might make a mom say, what the hell's going on here? And because of the involvement of the private parts, be very concerned that maybe something's happening to my kid. And then if they go back and they think about their ex and they remember what a deviant guy he was, and not with children, but some women infer from a man's general deviance that there's a correlation between whatever some guy's into and child sexual abuse. Multiple partners, I don't know, animals, leather, all kind of aberrant, outlying sexual interest. And, much of it doesn't hurt anybody, and it's not relevant at all. But there's really no correlation between those kinds of things and child sexual abuse. However, to the mother who's concerned, they start putting two and two together. That freaky sexual desires he had. My kid's having nightmares. She's preoccupied, with not going there. She's touching her private parts now and then. She doesn't want to see him. She's wet in the bed. Many of these things can arise from being sexually abused, but they can arise from all other kinds of trauma. So it's kind of a volatile mixture here. And then that mother asks suggestive questions or leading questions, and they're sincere. They're not out to get the guy or manufacture this, as many defense lawyers might suggest. They really think something happened because they're putting two and two and two and two together and saying he's capable of anything. And why is this happening? And it becomes almost self-fulfilling. And that's sad when that happens, and it happens sometimes. And you really need to examine the dynamics of what the mother saw and rule out all kinds of other things before you can safely begin to say this kid was molested by her father in that context, especially in the matrimonial context. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this now is because isn't that what Fournier said? And Barradell and Fournier, false allegations against respectable community members often occur because mothers suggested abuse-related details to their children. Back a sentence. They asserted that common childhood medical conditions were often mistaken as evidence of sexual abuse by mothers who would then question their children about sexual abuse. And that the potential for that happening today is still there. What I think is wrong is how frequent it is. To me, it's overstated by the defense and by people who are accused of sexual abuse in the context of a matrimonial case. Kids can get abused by their estranged fathers. Kids can get abused even in a custody case. They get abused in non-custody cases. Now, they're very hard to prosecute. They're very hard for the legal system. In some ways, they're almost impossible, but they ought to be treated with respect and just as much of an investigation as you would give any kid. You may be able to figure it out after one or two interviews, after a couple of days of investigation, or it may take longer. Getting back to the history lesson here today, though, we're trying to look at suggestibility throughout the years, and Suzanne Davis takes us on a tour to suggestibility. They talk about different examples of suggestibility, what he called retroactive hallucination, that's Bernheim, which we now call false memory. They tried to do a little bit of research where they actually watched what kids heard and then questioned them about what they heard so they knew the historical truth. And then the kids were questioned and they tried to assess how often they got it wrong and what the impact of suggestibility was. I'm going to jump to the modern research on suggestibility. You read the Davis article. I'm not going to spoon feed it to you. It takes us back throughout the years, and the primary point of the article is to give us some historical perspective on this issue of suggestibility. Probably the most important aspect of being a forensic interviewer, and the thing that gives interviewers the most anxiety, is their fear of being suggestive. And we'll take a closer look at that in ensuing classes, but this is just to put things in a little historical context. And the modern research about suggestibility arose primarily in the context of child victimization or sexual abuse of children. Okay? And because throughout most of the years, people were skeptical of children's recollections, they felt that kids weren't good at remembering stuff, and when they did remember stuff, they were easily misled. Well, along comes Gail Goodman, who was a researcher and an academic, and she began to conduct experiments on children's suggestibility. Her and her colleagues, and this was in the 1980s. And you'll see some of these in the article that you read, The New Wave in Child Suggestibility Research by Professor Tom Lyon and others of your readings. But just to touch upon this, Goodman and her colleagues conducted a number of studies where a clown interacts with a kid and then the children are questioned about what the clown did or didn't do, and other kinds of controlled situations where children experience an event that the researchers know exactly what happened, then they ask the kids questions, and then they ask misleading questions and suggestive questions, and they try to figure out how many mistakes or how many erroneous statements the children make about suggestion. We'll talk more about that later in this course. We'll look more closely at these experiments in the suggestibility module or unit, learning unit. But suffice it to say that Gail Goodman and her colleagues in this wave of suggestibility research demonstrated that kids remember stuff pretty good, even little kids, and that they aren't as vulnerable to suggestion as we first thought. It's Giles Corey. So Goodman showed that these kids are not that easily manipulated, and our fears about kids and suggestibility maybe are misplaced. Kids did pretty damn good at resisting suggestion, even the real little kids. Now, there were a few kids who said, "Oh, I was spanked by the clown and it never happened." There were a few kids who got it really wrong, but most of the time, kids did damn good. And then there came a couple of high-profile cases where the recollection of kids and their vulnerability to suggestibility was reviewed again. A number of researchers whose focus was on the inadequacy of children's memory conducted experiments, and as some people like to express it, as the pendulum swung the other way, and they were able to demonstrate that kids can be really vulnerable to suggestibility. They can even have false memories. False memories were created by Professor Cece, Professor Brock, and others in children. They were well documented. They were on television. You'll see some of them later. And the pendulum swung the other way, and there's a whole branch of suggestibility research that highlights the vulnerability of kids and shows that in the right circumstances, with repetitive, misleading, and erroneous questioning, kids can remember stuff that never really happened, and certainly, at times, color their recollections or have their recollections irrevocably distorted or changed so that the historical truth of what happened is obscured and we have a substitute recollection of the child because of the impact of suggestive questioning. Yes?
Wasn't that also compared to research among adults to substantiate the memory difference as to whether the kids were inadequate or not?
I don't understand the question. Wasn't there what?
Were there research on adults? Wasn't research done on adults as well in the same aspect as to whether they had a false memory because they were trying to suggest to them that certain things had occurred when they did it under hypnosis or something like that?
Yeah, well, you raise a good point here, and one we'll make later in the course. All people are suggestible. There's research on adult suggestibility. It is very popular among researchers to look at this in the context of the criminal law because that's where the stakes are high. And it's kind of fun to look at eyewitness testimony and things like that. All people are suggestible, and what we'll learn later is that kids, when they reach 11 or 12, they're no more suggestible than adults. So we're going to take a closer look at what age ranges kids are suggestible, just what are they suggestible about, and how can we avoid being suggestible. We'll look at that later. But yes, adults can be suggestible. The adult research really is not that relevant to the child research, except to say that they can be misled as well. There's a hearing going on in the criminal courts today. I sent our intern there to go watch, called a Wade hearing. And that's the name of the case, United States versus Wade. That's where they got the name for it. But the hearing's about an eyewitness who identified something. I don't know if she was a victim of a strong-arm robbery or she was an eyewitness to a murder. But when people see things in the criminal law, they'll bring you downtown or to the police station and see if you can identify the culprit, right? And no one does it like TV, although New York once in a blue moon does it like TV. But very rarely across the United States we have a lineup where the person is there and you turn left and you turn right. With real people. You know, they still do that. I think in the Bronx County they still do that for some reason in some cases. And it's hard to do. It's hard to get 10 guys who kind of look the same and are available and, you know. So the way you do it is with photographs. And the ideal way to do it now is to deliver the photographs like a deck of cards, not say anything, tell the person, even if they see the person, not to say anything, look at them all, think about it for a minute, and then tell me if you see the person. There has been a lot of research on that process, and the outcome is to do it the way I'm suggesting now. We used to give them all the pictures at once when I first started out. Again, we used photos. Now with digital photos and driver's licenses having photos, it's very easy to put a photo lineup together. As recently as 7 years ago, it was a pain in the butt to put a photo lineup together. You had to get big, like scrapbooks or picture books of arrestees, and every police station had thousands of them. But you had to go through one by one. Now, computer, facial structure, you can mix them up like a deck of cards and pick, 12 Caucasians with gray hair and small nose. But the point I'm trying to make is that process has the potential for suggestion with adults. And this hearing is about whether the police misled or suggested the person who the witness ultimately picked. Now, the police can suggest in a variety of ways, just like interviewers can be suggested in a forensic interview of children. The police might say, hey, you want to take a closer look at number 7? He's kind of looks Dominican. Why don't you want to take a closer look at number 7? Well, that's direct and overt and suggestive, right? Go take a look at 7. Here's why I think 7 ought to be focused on. Or in the way that the lineup is constructed, right? If you have 12 pictures and, the old cartoon you used to see was, which one is the man who robbed you? There's a man, there's a nun, there's a duck, and then there's a block of wood. Now, who's the guy? You know, the only one there is the guy, obviously, that's the worst kind of lineup. As Dr. Penrod would say, who testified in one of my cases on the impact of suggestibility and victim identification. Woo, that Giles Corey again. He's angry tonight. Yeah. So the police can be suggestive in what they say during the lineup. The police can be suggestive in the construct of the lineup. Whether one photograph, okay, is emphasized over any other photograph. You know, one time I tried a case, actually I did the pretrial hearing in this very fashion. It was a strong-arm robbery of a Dominican travel agent. And the accountant was working late one night, and they came in and they had guns and they robbed all the money and they took some other stuff. They brought the guy in, and they said, "Can you identify the men who came in and robbed the travel agent?" He said, "I think I can. We're going to do a photo array." And they had a bead on who they thought it was because it was related to other robberies in the area. So they had a guy who they thought was among the robbers. And the guy who said it, the man who worked, the accountant who was working at the travel agent said, "They looked like they were Peruvian or South American Hispanic men." Excuse me. So the cops who did this array, and it was a young detective who became a very accomplished detective now, but he was early in his career as a patrolman, he put together 12 pictures. They were all of Hispanic men about 20 to 25 years old. But the only Hispanic man who was of South American origin was the defendant. And I remember Judge Leapese going, "They're all Hispanic, blah, blah." And in my mind, they had a Latina, a woman defense lawyer, who made the argument that, yes, there's 12 Hispanic men, they're all about 20, 25, they all got a little bit of scruff. But all of the guys other than my client were Caribbean Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, right? The only guy who was of South American, you can leave that open, just push it open. The only guy who was of South American descent was my guy. And my guy stuck out like a sore thumb. My guy was overemphasized. This was a suggestive lineup. And I thought about that. You know, I'm arguing the other way, but I thought about it privately. I'm like, man, it kind of makes sense. Because the jawbone and the facial structure of the South American Hispanics, especially Peruvians and others from that area of South America, and the interrelations with the native Indians throughout the years, the facial structure is different. In fact, the witness said these were Peruvian-looking guys. The witness was a Spanish guy, Hispanic. He had enough understanding of who he was looking at and what he was seeing to say, that's what these guys look like. And Dr. Penrod, who's a researcher on this kind of thing, would say that that lineup had was the functional equivalent of a one-person lineup. Although there were 12 people there, you could throw out 11 of them because they didn't fit what the guy described. There was only one person who fit what the guy described. The guy in the courtroom. You might as well have showed her one picture. You might as well hit her on the head with a big rubber mallet and said, "Pick number 9. I won. Judge Leapese, who was an old school judge, and he said, "They're all Hispanic. I don't get it." He upheld it. Guys were acquitted. Found not guilty. I felt good about that. I didn't try the case. Never wrong. Interesting, right? So suggestibility can arise from law enforcement or child protection or anybody else interacting with children or adults. There's always a concern about suggestibility in any endeavor, especially forensic interviewing children, because as you'll see later, children less than 11 are more vulnerable, and preschoolers really vulnerable to suggestion. Any questions about Suzanne Davis's article? No? All right. You know, I don't think it works in Firefox. I think you need to go to.
I just put that,
Yeah, you can look it up, but there's a player, and I think it only works in Internet Explorer. Let's take a look while we're here. So we. Yeah, you could search on YouTube.
I had Firefox in front of me.
It worked with you for
Yeah.
with a Firefox? Well, maybe it's the version that's here. They may have pop-ups blocked.
Yeah, they do. You have to
Yeah, that's a pop-up
tools
within Firefox.
and no, it's on the browser.
Yeah, this is the browser, Firefox. You go into
The internet.
yeah, I just cut and paste.
If you go to
yeah, that'll work. But I want there's 15 of these in here. I'd like to make them work for the students, and you could do that. It should pop right out, and let's just see. I don't use Firefox anymore, but you need to go into options somewhere, and there's a pop-up. Let's see. Tabs. Yeah, you're going to have to go in. I'm not going to find it now, but if you Google how to allow pop-ups in Firefox, if you're using Firefox,
go to tools. You see up top where it says tools?
that was just there. Where's tools?
Tools. You just,
I saw,
it was just there.
yeah, here, options.
It was on top under the little website browser. You put the link.
Oh, she's talking about Internet Explorer.
Oh, that's Internet Explorer.
No, that's not. It's
Okay.
just yeah, right there.
Yeah, this is Internet Explorer. But I'll turn off pop-off blocker. That's how you can do it in
Marks
there.
off of there. That's where I'm at.
Yeah. But this thing uses, and some people use Firefox, and that has a pop-up blocker.
Firefox gives you too much trouble.
The most recent version of Internet Explorer,
Yeah, you don't have
the most recent version seems to work pretty well. But I tell you what, you really need to use Internet Explorer 9 and you'll be okay, because Chrome doesn't work. I use Google's Chrome a lot at home, and it doesn't work for our course. They say that Firefox does.
Well, Blackboard's also supposed to go offline at 7 o'clock.
Tonight?
Yeah, for an hour. So that's 17,000.
Oh, well, it's 7:14. Why would they go Blackboard offline in the middle of class? Do it at 2 in the morning.
They're having issues with it.
But you were already on that time. No,
We're going to have to... Come on, why is this black now? Oh, I see. Yeah, it's dead. But, well, they'll catch up to you.
I've been logged on to
Yeah, well, you see mine's not working. So.
Shoot.
Bruce Button, when did you last see Mr. Jacobs?
Something like that when I was sick.
Bruce, you are mistaken. You know me. I am Mr. Jacobs, your neighbor.
He comes to my window. He say, my dear, but I will have your life if you testify against me in court.
Well, Your Honor, I must have these sticks to Boston. How may I come through a window? I know nothing about
Ruth Putnam has informed me that there is a black man whispering in your ear.
The film that I took that clip from stars Daniel Day-Lewis and Winona Ryder, and it's from The Crucible, which was a screenplay written by Arthur Miller. It's been the subject of plays and films for many years. This is among the more recent treatments of it. I really like Daniel Day-Lewis, and Winona Ryder is pretty good in this too. And this is very well done. It's a stirring movie, to say the least. But that's just a little snippet to think about. And you see more of the courtroom scenes in the film when they come down from Boston. The local magistrate is getting way beyond his abilities, so they bring in the fancy Harvard-educated lawyers from Boston, and that was that guy there. That lawyer, that judge, it was a panel of judges, and they take the testimony of children. And, for all the reasons we talked about earlier, there's tremendous concern about what's going on with these kids. And the movie does a nice job of depicting the origins.
It's not that historical.
No, the movie has been criticized. When you go up to Salem, they're very emphatic about it in that community about, Bernard Shaw's not that accurate either, the great playwright. But they have, did you buy any of the things? I bought the little transcripts, and they sell the transcripts for $2 at the stores up there. You can buy the actual transcripts of the trial. And some of the courtroom scenes are based upon the transcripts. But some of the people, they changed their impact, their role, they created characters, like any Hollywood picture. They mess with it. But some of the central characters are there. I think it was Abigail Paris, was it? Abigail? The Paris kid, the Reverend, Rebecca Nurse.
Basically, characters related.
Yeah.
Yeah. All the characters.
Did you go see Rebecca Nurse's homestead when you were up there?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That's what I did for my 16th.
Ran around Salem, Mass?
Ran around the party.
Yeah, it's good.
Instead of a party.
Better than having a Sweet 16 at the so-and-so club. Bottle service, I guess.
At 16.
Did you watch Sweet 16? Hollywood style? No, I don't know. I have no idea. Actually, they have a show on. That's not on anymore. I don't know. Reality shows. They had that. What was that?